Okay, this is the nervous system 3, part 3. We're going to discuss the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and spinal cord. We will discuss the coverings of the brain and cord, otherwise known as the meninges. We'll talk about CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, what the spinal cord structure and function is, and we're going to cover the brainstem, cerebellum, and what's called the diencephalon. Let's go. So the brain and spinal cord are the central nervous system. Test question. Important to know. Everything outside of that is the peripheral nervous system. There are some coverings that protect the brain and the spinal cord. They are collectively called meninges. Here we've got a little cube, a little section, if you will, of the different aspects from the bone on the exterior of your skull, and the dura mater, which is just on the inside of that. Very, very strong meninges, singular, and that actually attaches to the bone. And then we've got what's called the arachnoid mater. It looks like little spider webs, little arachnid-like structures in there, spiders, spider webs, and there's blood vessels in there throughout, nerves. And then we've got a very gentle covering over the surface of the brain. That's called the pia mater. So dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. And here they are again, different views of them. Dura mater means tough mother. Tough mother. So it's the toughest and most outer lying covering. Right? Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, that wispy looking spider web stuff with a lot of vasculature coursing through it. And then the pia mater is directly on top of the brain. Very slight layer. We can just pull up on a probe on top of our sheep brain. So the dura mater, again, tough mother. It's a strong, white fibrous tissue. Really, really tough. And it's the outermost layer of the meninge being pulled off of this guy's brain right here. It is attached, contiguous with the periosteum, which we know is the skin of the bone. So it kind of seamlessly inserts into the periosteum. There are some different extensions of the dura. There's the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. I'm not concerned with you knowing them, not in lecture anyway, but just know that the dura is tough, one tough mother, and it covers the brain, protects it. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater. Look at all the space that it creates with these little wispy spider web, little extensions. Space for a lot of blood vessels to move through. So the dura, the arachnoid mater rather, is very highly vascular. And then the pia is just on top of the surface of the brain. And here we see it in this green little extension just laying right on top of the brain's surface. There is an extension of pia mater. Looks like a little piece of tissue paper, a little line, string that's hanging down from the end of the spinal cord, and it's called the filum terminale. It's going to go all the way down to your pelvic area, and it's going to attach right on the tip of the coccyx, which is down here, right? We're going to call this the coccyx. So that filum terminale is going to go, it's going to attach right there. The end of the spinal cord will be right here. So that filum terminale is a string. Attaches it, kind of anchors it down there. So around these meninges, there are some spaces. Now, they're not very big, but they're big enough to fill up with blood if you would be bumped on the noggin sufficiently. And so here we've got what we're going to call a subdural hematoma. Subdural, so it's underneath the dura mater, the tough mother. And when it gets underneath there, the blood can puddle, and If the hose is not mended, we don't get surgery quick, or the body doesn't stop clot that bleed, you can get pressure start to build down on the brain, and that'll reduce or completely halt all the function, the important function that's happening in this area. So that wouldn't be good. So there are perimeningeal spaces. There are the epidural space, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. And those are, they are what they are. The epidural space would be above the dura. The subdural would be below. The subarachnoid below. So it would be arachnoid. Moderate. The epidural space is used for different medical procedures. So here we've got an epidural injection being delivered, and what happens there, as we know, the central nervous system is going to consist of the brain and spinal cord. So we can go down below the spinal cord, and we can go inject in the epidural space and deliver some pain mediating medication, something that would maybe numb all the nerves within that area of the spinal cord. So this would be helpful in childbirth. This would be helpful if there was surgery was required. So they can quite safely inject below the spinal cord, which ends, by the way, at the spinal level L2. There's something called a conus medullaris. So it would spinal cord would terminate, would form a cone, and they would always inject below that. So they know they're not going to compromise, they couldn't compromise the cord. And here, incidentally, you see this patient flexing, bending forward, so that she can open up these spinous processes. They're going to fan away from one another to create space so they can go in and inject. This is subdural space, and we talked about the commonsensical location of that. So these are all the folds of the brain matter itself. Here's the bone, here's the dura. Underneath the dura, we've got a bleed that's happening here. Maybe this person got in a car accident, God forbid, or some sort of bump on the noggin, and there's a bleed that's pressing down on the brain. You can see how it does that very, very clearly. The subarachnoid space, this is going to be located between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. There's a lot of CSF that circulates within this subarachnoid space. CSF is cerebrospinal fluid, bathes the nervous tissue, and tests it to make sure that it has appropriate chemical composition. So here we are in that space, and the blue is the CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. It's going to also cushion the brain and spinal cord. So imagine yourself in water and moving your body around, and how it's very relaxing. It provides a lower, not a zero gravity environment, but a lower gravity environment, so that the impacts are less. So in that way, the cerebrospinal fluid cushions the brain and spinal cord, and it also allows, when it circulates the CSF, and it goes all the way down around the cord and back up and around and back up and around, it monitors the chemical composition of the environment around the brain and spinal cord. So if there was a disease process, let's say there's bacteria in there, that would be a bad thing. It would monitor that, and it would send some cells to go in there and hopefully gobble up the bad bacteria, or there could be an infection. That would be called encephalitis, and that's not good. So it's important to monitor the chemical composition. There are some fluid spaces within the brain. These are called the ventricles. Okay, there are two lateral ventricles, one for each hemisphere, because you've got a right and left side of the brain. Those are called hemispheres. So those fluid spaces, they're going to help in the circulation of the CSF. They're going to help provide cushion and make sure that the entire brain, even the internal aspect, is monitored. There are 4 ventricles within the brain. There are the 2 lateral, there's a 3rd ventricle, and then there is the 4th ventricle down here. Some other views of that. These are the lateral ventricles. This is the 3rd. This little canal here is called the cerebral aqueduct, and this diamond-shaped structure down here is the 4th ventricle. From the 4th ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid goes all the way down the central canal of the spinal cord. CSF is produced by the choroid plexus. This looks like a little piece of chewing gum or something that somebody gnashed up with their teeth and then stuck up in their head. So this choroid plexus, this is tissue here that produces cerebrospinal fluid. It filters blood and it creates this special fluid from the blood that it filters, and it circulates that. That is the CSF. By the way, this is a coronal slice of the cerebrum and the brainstem, or frontal, coronal, whatever. The circulation, how does it occur? Okay, it goes around and around and around. Just need to know that the CSF is produced by the choroid plexus, and there are ventricles that are spaces within the brain and around it that are going to send that circulating fluid all the way around the brain, throughout all the structures, down the center of the spinal cord. Just know that it circulates and it monitors and it cushions. Moving on to the spinal cord. Here's a cross section of the spinal cord. It looks like at the maybe T9 level, spinal level. So we've got an H-like or butterfly-like structure forming the center, and that is gray matter. Gray matter is comprised of cell bodies. All the white around it, these are called funiculi. This is white matter. Gray matter, white matter. Gray matter is cell bodies, white matter are axons, or the actual wires of the neurons, right? That's wiring. Cell bodies. Some of the anatomy of the spinal cord are as follows. This is anterior and this is posterior. So your spinous process of the spine, if the actual spinal bones, the vertebrae, were present, that would be what it would look like. The spinous process, we've taken that off, removed all that. This lies within the central canal of the spinal column, right? So this is anterior, and there's a fissure there. Fissure is a deep groove. Sulcus, it's posterior median sulcus, which is going to be a more shallow groove. So that's one way you can know which is anterior, which is posterior. There's a central canal, which is a little pinpoint hole that the CSF is going to circulate down. Right. There are horns within this H, or butterfly. So this is anterior, telling by the fissure. This is the anterior horn, the lateral horn, and the posterior horn. Same thing other side. Anterior, lateral, posterior horns. This white matter in the front is the anterior column, or the anterior funiculus. Posterior funiculus. Lateral funiculus. To the anterior and posterior aspects of the cord, we've got nerves that come in or leave. So in the anterior aspect, okay, we've got the anterior horn. The anterior horn is motor, so it's going to send messages out. It's going to power muscles. It's going to cause glands to secrete things. The posterior aspect of the spinal cord, information comes into that. So anterior horn, anterior spinal root, motor going out. Posterior horn, posterior spinal root, and something called the dorsal root ganglion here, that's the swelling in the nerve root. And those are going to, fibers are going to enter the posterior horn or the dorsal horn. And that is all sensory information. You can tell with the different colors of the axons over here. So motor is going to be information leaving, or efferent information. Anterior horn, efferent information. Motor. Posterior horn, afferent information. Sensory. You got to know it. Memorize it. There are different bulges in the cervical and lumbar regions. There are enlargements or bulges. You can see them here. Why? Very simply because of your arms and legs. There's more nerves to distribute. All right? So we have to send nerves coursing down and up into the arms and legs. So there needs to be more nerves, so there's an enlargement in those areas. Anatomy again. Now we flip the spinal cord around. So this is where the spinous process would be, and this will be the transverse process. Right? So we can orient ourselves. Posterior sulcus, anterior median fissure. It's deep. So since this is the anterior side, and this is the posterior, we know that anterior is going to be motor, posterior is going to be sensory. The butterfly is gray matter. Everything around it is white matter. Axons, wires. Nerve roots, as I illustrated already. From those horns, let's start with the ventral or anterior horn. That's motor, so it's going to send information out. This is called the anterior nerve root. This is called the posterior nerve root. And this swelling is the dorsal root ganglion. So we've got information coming in through one of these roots, the posterior root. We've got information going out via the anterior roots. Out here, we've got a mixed wire that carries both sensory and motor information. Know the anatomy, understand the physiology. Within the gray matter horns, the butterfly, so in the center here, we've got what are called interneurons. So these are like little short extension cords, little relay wires that are within the gray matter there. So as information comes in via this dorsal root, sensory information comes in, it links up with an interneuron, and it's going to relay that sensory information to the anterior horn, and the anterior horn is going to generate a response. So this is how reflexes happen. We've got sensory information coming in. Ooh, I touched the hot skillet. Ow. You don't even think about it, right? You don't think about ow. You just generates a response. There's damage. There's some sort of hazard. That information is received in the cord. This little relay comes in here, plugs into the motor, and it pulls your hand away. Another good illustration of the spinal cord, spinal nerves. Note that this is the dura mater, tough mother. This is the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater will be right on the surface of the spinal cord, just like it would be on the surface of the brain. It's contiguous throughout the central nervous system. Contiguous means, continual. So, we talked about the different anatomy. Let's review it again. This is going to be posterior or dorsal. This is ventral. So this is the sulcus. This is the fissure, nice and deep. This is the dorsal root ganglion. So we know that this is sensory information coming in to the cord. This must be the anterior root or the ventral root. So that's going to be motor, sending information out. Right here, those two, sensory and motor, they're going to mix. And so a spinal nerve is going to be right here. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves, meaning that they carry both sensory and motor. The cauda equina is the end, from the end of the spinal cord. Remember we talked about L2. Here's L2. It's your second lumbar spinal segment. So below that, there is no spinal cord. The spinal cord ends at L2. So we're going to deliver an epidural. This is where we would do it, below L2. The end of the spinal cord at L2 is called the conus medullaris. And here it is. From the conus, there are still nerves that hang down. They're just not part of the cord. And these nerves kind of look like a tail, a horse's tail, so we call it the cauda equina. Gray matter versus white matter. Gray matter is the butterfly. White matter are the dorsal, ventral, lateral columns, otherwise called funiculi. Single column, so this would be a funiculus. Dorsal funiculus, ventral or dorsal, sulcus, ventral fissure, anterior, posterior, lateral funiculi, wiring hangs out in those areas. What does the cord do? The spinal cord controls a lot of things reflexively, mostly. All right. So all of these organs you see here, from salivary glands to the heart and lungs, the stomach, your bladder, the spinal cord is going to help act as like a junction box, a big extension cord, power strip that all these things plug into, just like peripheral devices on your computer, just like we have a circuit that attaches you from your computer to the mouse or the keyboard or your monitor. All of these structures are going to be very similar. They're going to plug into the cord and help control it. So within the spinal cord, there are tracts, and tracts are like these areas of nerves that are going to move up and down every which way. An ascending tract, ascending is going up. So ascending is going to send a message up the cord. If it goes up the cord, it's probably going to go to the brain stem or the brain. It's probably going to be sensory information. Descending tracts, if there's something, information descending within the spinal cord, it's most likely motor. It's message coming from the brain out to the cord and likely out, sending a motor stimulus. So here are some of the tracts that we have there. We've got names that we've come up with, like the lateral spinothalamic tract. All right. That's going to take information, nervous information from the spine, the spinal cord, to the thalamus. Thalamus is a huge walnut-sized reflex center we have on either side of the brain. It's going to help us determine crude touch, pain, temperature. Whereas the anterior spinothalamic tract, they're going to mediate crude touch and pressure. There's another area that's called fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. This isn't testable, those are just FYI. Different tracts that exist within the spinal cord. Discriminating touch, kinesthesia. Then there's ascending tracts to send information in to the brain. There are descending tracts that are going to mediate information coming out. So they'll be phrased differently. So it'll be corticospinal. So the cortico, think about cerebral cortex. The brain itself sending information down the spinal cord. Spinal reflexes. We did these in both in lecture and lab. Here you're going to touch something sharp or hot. Reflexively, you've got a stimulus occurring, so you've got pain, or pain receptor goes off in the fingertip. It's going to go all the way up this nerve into the spinal cord. It's going to go in which side? The sensory side. So we know that is the dorsal root. Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Sensory information comes in, links up with an interneuron, and there's an automatic response that goes out lightning speed. Too fast to notice. It's going to power a muscle. So that would be you're pulling your hand away. Slow it down. Harmful stimuli is detected instantaneously. Goes into the cord. You've got a reflexive response. And only then, once we've felt that pain, we've already removed our hand from the danger. So, pretty incredible. The brain itself, hey, it's one of our largest organs. It's about a pound, or 3 pounds rather, or 1.4 kilograms. There was some Russian dude with a 4-pound brain, and he's long gone, but must have been a smart dude. There are billions of neurons, 100 billion neurons estimated within the brain. Neurons, of course, are the standard nerve cells, right, that we've drawn and depicted with electrical wires and all kinds of stuff. And in addition to the neurons, there are billions upon billions of glial cells, or neuroglia. And those are support cells that feed the neurons and protect them, clean up after them, produce myelin that insulates them, produce cerebral spinal fluid. Glial cells are support cells. So know about them. And the brain and the spinal cord, they form during, as we're developing in the womb. Our brains and our spinal cords are starting to develop very rapidly. And then just after birth, even, as we encounter our environments for the first time, the neural structures all grow. Your brain gets bigger, more connections, more synapses firing. And throughout life, depending upon our activities, we are going to make connections with whatever we're doing. Things are physical, things that are mental, our studying. Our brain is going to constantly change, remodel, depending upon our activities of life. There are different parts of the brain, and real deep, we've got our very primitive brain. So if you look at the sheep brain, it doesn't look much bigger than this. So the sheep is a less evolved structure than us. It's got a smaller cerebral cortex here. So it's got a little tiny one like that. And we have comparatively larger brains. So we're capable of more processing. Here's the brain stem, which is comprised of the medulla oblongata. Below that is the spinal cord. Above that is the pons. And above the pons is the midbrain. Here's the thalamus that we have talked about, which is a major relay center structure within the brainstem. Very important. Incidentally, this is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum, cord, medulla, pons, midbrain. What does the medulla do? It helps to mediate a lot of the very important structures functions rather, that we do automatically. So it's a reflex center. It helps you keep your heart beating, keep your respiration occurring. all the information. There's tracks that are there are nuclei within the medulla, which are going to help receive and send messages both up and down the central nervous system. And there's the pons above that. A lot of white matter, a lot of wiring that is coursing through the pons. Reticular formation is going to be throughout the medulla and the pons, and that's going to help us maintain our consciousness. A quick review: cerebral cortex, cerebral medulla is going to be inside that. It's going to be gray and white matter, respectively. Corpus callosum, fornix, thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, or the massa intermedia, anterior commissure, posterior commissure, pituitary gland, infundibulum, hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, cerebellum, arbor vitae, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, frontal lobe. Midbrain is going to be positioned above the pons, as in yellow here. We've got white matter that's coursing through there, so a lot of tracts, information coming and going. Structures called the cerebral peduncles. They conduct impulses between the midbrain and cerebrum. So between here and here. There are two structures that are also located in the midbrain called the colliculi, or corpora quadrigemina. And they're back here. And there's one that's a round thing, a little bump called the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. The superior is going to be visual, and inferior colliculus is going to be auditory. The eyes are above the ears. Right? So remember that. It's a little handy-dandy way to remember what they do. Important relay centers for vision and hearing. Different functions of the brainstem that we discussed: reflex activities, your heart beating, respiration, reflexes, things like coughing, sneezing, gag reflex. Cerebellum is this broccoli-looking structure, and one of my students in lab have described it as that in the back, posterior inferior aspect of the brain. So it's the second largest part of the brain. It's got a lot of neurons in there, okay? Far more than all the nervous structures put together in the cerebellum. So remember that this cerebellum has a lot of nerves in it, more than anything else, and that's important because there must be a lot of stuff going on there. There must be a lot of function if there's a lot of structure. So the cortex is going to be gray matter, cell bodies, and the interior aspect mostly white matter. You cut this in half, you'll see that there's the tree of life, or the arbor vitae, a little broccoli, little tree-looking structure within there. There are tracks within the cerebellum. Information coming in, information leaving. Most of the information about posture and muscular control, motor control. Here are some examples of cerebellar functions. Talked about the field sobriety test. Somebody's got to walk heel to toe, or do something that involves fine motor skill, tapping your fingers, each of your fingers on your thumb, from digit to digit. these sorts of functions would be impaired in somebody who had inadequate cerebellar function. So when you're drunk, you are impairing, you're depressing your central nervous system, and people oftentimes can't perform these basic tests, can't coordinate things. So remember that your cerebellum has to do with coordination. And here's a good example here. We've got, if you like zombies, everybody's into zombies. A normal human's got a pretty sizable cerebellum, and then we've got a fast zombie. It's, you know, still kind of like slow and awkward. And a slow zombie almost has no cerebellum, and they fall down. You can outrun them easily. So, as I stated, we've got posture, balance, coordination. These are the functions that the cerebellum is responsible for. It receives information from the cord, from the cerebrum, information coming in, and helps the body and the central nervous system act on that information coming in. So a lot of connections happening in the cerebellum, and you definitely want to be functioning well. Otherwise, you fall down. There's an area within the brain called the diencephalon. It consists of several structures around one of the ventricles, the third, and important structures. The thalamus is right smack dab in the middle. It's a round structure. You can see it pretty well, even on your sheep brain, which is tinier comparatively. And that thalamus is a very important relay area. Inferior and anterior to the thalamus, we've got the hypothalamus, and that's going to perform a lot of important functions, such as, you know, determining your hydration, and it's going to produce hormones that are going to control other glands. Really important stuff. Your pineal gland, your timekeepers gland, that is also going to be located in the diencephalon. Expanding on the thalamus, again, it's a relay station. Almost all nervous information that comes in from the cord up to the brain, it stops along the way at this very important rest stop. Remember, there's a thalamus on each side, each hemisphere, with two walnut-sized structures. Sensations that are coming in, the thalamus receives that information on pain, temperature. All the sensory information, for the most part, receives, stops along the way at the thalamus. Emotions are going to be mediated in part in the thalamus. Reflexive actions, thalamus. Now the hypothalamus was down here. The thalamus is right here. So anterior slightly and inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Different structures there. Produces hormones. Right? So this is the hypothalamus, and this is the pituitary. This thing has got different parts to it, the pituitary, but it hangs down. And there are pathways from the thalamus, hypothalamus, where hormones are going to be produced. It's going to send information. It's going to work very closely with the pituitary, which releases a lot of hormones. Hypothalamus is very important in maintaining your temperature, normal body temperature, water balance, arousal. Also in the diencephalon, there's the pineal gland. And this is towards the back. It's oftentimes a dark structure in our sheep brains. We found some really good pineal glands, or what's often called the pineal body. And this is known as the timekeeping hormone because it secretes a hormone called melatonin, which you may have heard of. And melatonin is released a lot at night, whereas during the day, the levels decrease. So it helps us maintain our circadian rhythms. And some people will take the hormone melatonin supplement, they'll supplement with it so that they can try to regulate their circadian rhythms. sleep better. That was a lot of information. Let's stop there. We'll pick back up at the nervous system 4.